Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Strengthening Your Security Posture During a Pandemic. My name is Ron Gula. I will be hosting today a conversation with Karim Hijazi from Prevailion and David Baggett from INKY. So I'm very happy to be here. I've been in the industry a good number of years. I'm involved now with more than 30 different companies, including both of our guests today. And before I became a cyber investor, I was the CEO of Tenable Network Security and then had a career in the Air Force and the National Security Agency. COVID has really changed how we all work, how we interact with everybody, and how we are protecting our data. We're all working from home now, which really means we're working from a hostile environment. And almost every organization out there is scrambling to try to figure out how they can protect and yet enable everybody who's out there. At the same time, when we talk about cutting employees or having to make tough calls, if we're furloughing employees or potentially problem employees, we're dramatically increasing our chance of insider risk. So a lot of our cyber projects have also been reprioritized as well. What might have been an internet, access kind of thing might now be the most important thing out there. So there's been a lot of changes. We've also seen a dramatic change in the cyber landscape, the actual threats that are out there. Almost overnight, we've seen phishing attacks that target information, people who are expecting to get information about Corona and COVID. And also people just targeting how we're working, trying to spoof Zoom meetings, joining our Zoom meetings and trying to invite us to those things. And then more interestingly, China and Russia are actually doing a dramatic amount of disinformation, trying to exacerbate the economic downturn here in the United States with both misinformation and misattribution of perhaps the causes for the actual disease. And then for the actual cyber ecosystem, almost every company who's offering a cyber product is now sort of reassessing how they can get their product in the hands of people in a more easier way and actually trying to demonstrate more value. And this might seem like a counterintuitive thing if you're on the buyer side, because you're probably inundated with calls from the plethora of cyber solutions that are out there. But this is now the time that organizations are really taking stock of what is the most important thing for their organization to protect on. And today we have two examples of companies who are offering solutions that are not only easy to install, but offer dramatic amounts of protection for your data and for your employees. And they also enable how your companies can protect themselves when the next wave of regulation is coming. So with that, I want to turn over to our two main speakers. Dave Baggett, the CEO of INKY, is going to present first on some of the more recent findings from their anti-phishing program. David, please take it away.
Thanks a lot, Ron. It's great to be here. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. As Ron said, I'm the founder and CEO of INKY, and we're focused on protecting against email-based phishing attacks. So I thought what I'd do today is give you a little overview of who we are and what we do, and then show a bunch of interesting examples of COVID-19 phishing that we've caught recently, just to kind of give everyone a sense of what we're up against. So my background is a little unusual. I have been in cybersecurity since around 2012. Before that, I was a co-founder of a company called ITA Software. If you used Google Flights, that's now what ITA was acquired by Google. Now it's Google Flights. And before that, if you ever played the game Crash Bandicoot, I was one of the two developers on that. So I've had sort of an interesting path to get to cybersecurity, but obviously been focusing on phishing since around 2015. And one thing that people always ask me, I remember when an angel investor asked me this, it really struck me. This is probably 5 years ago. What is there left to do in email security? Why is this still a problem? And so I always like to address this with an audience. In general, if you think about machine learning and cybersecurity, the first place machine learning was really used in cybersecurity was spam filtering. And this dates back to the 90s. And the approach there was to use what are called Bayesian models to train these machine learning models to recognize and distinguish good mail from bad mail. So the models would learn things like, if there's $ signs in the subject line, it's probably spammy. And what's happened is, the big incumbent vendors have sort of deployed this kind of technology at industrial scale, and it works really well for discriminating good from bad content. But the fundamental problem is it doesn't work well in phishing, because the whole goal of the attacker in phishing is to make you think that he's a person or a brand you trust. And in the limit, the attacker can just take a real mail from, let's say, Microsoft, resend that with one link changed, and then the content is by definition identical to what's in the real Microsoft mail. So these Bayesian models don't work very well, and we've had to draw from machine learning work that's been done in the 2010s, that kind of time frame, and apply it to the mail protection space. And broadly, we do three unique things at INKY. The first is that we use techniques derived from the computer vision literature to identify brand forgeries. So INKY actually renders the mail and runs classifiers on all the visual indicators of the mail: imagery, text, colors, layout, to see, is this really a mail? Does it look like a mail from Microsoft? If so, is it really from Microsoft? And that lets us find the whole class of phishing that's called, in our case, brand forgery. The second thing we do is, obviously the other kind of phishing is impersonation also, except instead of a brand being impersonated, it's a person. And so the fake mail that looks like it's from your CFO, or the fake mail from someone who is your vendor. And in that case, we use, again, techniques drawn from the academic work done in machine learning in the 2010s, but in this case, more around anomaly detection. And the basic idea there is, as INKY sees examples of mail from each sender, it starts to develop an idea of what that person's normal mail looks like. So it's things like, what mail infrastructure do they typically use? Where in the world do they typically mail you from? What kind of language do they use in the body of the mail, and so on? And that lets us determine, does this look like a normal mail that, say, Ron would send to me, or does it look like someone's impersonating Ron? And that lets us deal with the other kind of phishing. Again, we've got, on the one hand, brand forgery, where it's impersonating a brand. On the other hand, spear phishing, or BEC, or CEO impersonation, where it's impersonating an individual. And then finally, we change the user experience in a novel way. Typically mail protection is invisible except when it's bothering you. So mail went to quarantine. How come? How do I get it back out? And then if the mail comes to you and it looks funny or it looks suspicious, you wonder, well, why didn't it tell me about this? So what we like to do is we put banners into the mail and we inject them right into the HTML content of the mail, so that there doesn't need to be any plugin or any special mail client, just becomes part of the mail. And it looks kind of like this. So, you can see down on the right, there's the gray banner, yellow banner, and red. And the basic idea here is, we may not know everything about an email. If we know it's malicious, we can put a red banner on it that says, hey, we're sure this is bad. And customers can decide whether they want to have red banner mail delivered or have them go straight to quarantine. But there's often a middle category where we either aren't sure the mail's bad, there's just not enough information to prove it's a forgery or not, or maybe it's a fine email, but we want the user to know something about it. So an example would be, hey, INKY thinks this is a wire request. Your company policy requires you to confirm wires outside of email. So don't wire money based on an email. Similarly, it might be if we see something like change your password, don't change your password on the basis of an email. So an email that may be legitimate, but we want the user to know something, that's when we put a yellow banner on. And the yellow banner, you can almost think of it as, micro-targeted training specifically about that email. And then the gray banner is for, we just want to let you know in a very clear way, who was the email address who sent this to you. And again, this just goes right in the mail. So whether you're looking at this on your phone, in the Apple iPhone client, whether you're looking at it on your desktop, doesn't really matter. You're going to see this same banner. And our customers really like this because it gives a lot more visibility to what the mail protection system's doing. And then the final thing we do on user experience is we put this link there. It's a little tiny, but you can see it in the right corner there. Report this mail, and that lets users report mail from any endpoint. So let's say they're on their phone, they want to report this to their SOC or their admin, they just click the report this mail link, and then we prompt them to classify it as, well, what do you think it is, safe, spam, or phishing? They send it, and then it sends a complete unaltered copy of it to their SOC. So what we've done is we've tried to take, again, a combination of new detection methodologies, drawn from work done in the 2010s decade on machine learning, and wrap that in a better user experience to essentially empower the end users to make better decisions on the mails that are in between, and just block a lot more of this bad stuff before it even gets to end users. So with that, I'm going to shift to what is probably the most interesting part for everyone, which is I'm going to show you a bunch of mail that we've caught at INKY that specifically targets people in the COVID-19 environment of fear and anxiety. And all of these mails are real mails. We haven't altered them in any way except to remove PII. So the only changes we've made here are that we've blurred out PII, but these are all mails that our customers, end users, received. The first one is obviously an insurance scam, and this is purporting to be from Cigna. And it looks pretty realistic. I think a lot of people would believe this is a real mail from Cigna. Now, notice that if you don't have Cigna as your insurance carrier, you might think, well, this isn't going to fool me. One thing that's worth pointing out here is that the attacker doesn't care that the attack works on everyone. They just care that it works on someone. So if you imagine, put yourself in the position of some recipient who does have Cigna as their carrier, then all of a sudden this looks really, really plausible. And you're likely to click through on that big call to action button right in the middle of the email. And this one we saw very early in the whole Corona crisis. This came, second week of March when it was just starting to become clear this was going to be a big problem. Comes from a hijacked Indonesian account and a Russian IP. That doesn't necessarily mean that it was sent by Russian people, but we could sort of tell where it came from. This one's really interesting because although the mail itself doesn't look that convincing, the mechanism of action here is incredibly scary. Now, this is sent to somebody and targeted to them, and they would have known who this vendor is. So this is impersonating a vendor the end user knew. And it's saying, this was fairly early on in the COVID crisis too. And this one, the setup is, hey, normally I would be able to travel and see you in San Francisco, but I can't because of quarantine. So here's this attachment. And this one, our analysts did a lot of work on this to understand how this worked, and it's quite interesting. So it has this attachment, which is .slk, which I didn't actually know what this was until the analyst explained it to me. And basically what this is it's called a symbolic link, and it dates back to the 80s, literally the 1980s, and it's used to share data between Excel files. And what's terrible about this is this thing is enabled by default to have macros even in current versions of Excel. So if you open this SLK file into your Excel, it's allowed by default. The default policy that Microsoft still has in the current Excel is let this thing run its macros. And what the thing's macros do is they basically write a batch file to the file system and then run it. So they're running executable code on the victim's machine that installs a remote access, so almost like a desktop sharing, remote desktop. So it gives the attacker complete visibility in the end user's desktop, and it lets them control it. And obviously this is incredibly nasty. But what I thought was interesting about this one, beyond this, it's able to write a file to the file system and run it, is it highlights one of the challenges that we have in mail security, which is complexity always increases, it never decreases. So here you have this file format, and I looked this up on Wikipedia. The last change to this standard was 1986. So you've got this file format that we honestly don't know if people use this legitimately anymore. So we can't just say, let's just strip all these attachments. We don't know, maybe someone's workflow depends on using this. At the same time, it's clearly a glaring security hole. And it's probably one of thousands of these kinds of file formats that we don't even know what they do anymore. And so, with the obvious things like .exes, we can just strip them. No one's going to send an exe to somebody. But this sort of highlights there are all these in-between cases where, okay, there's an attachment type. Someone's workflow might depend on it. So you don't just want to remove them all, but then it's a huge security hole. So, and that's not a challenge that's unique to us. I mean, every mail security vendor has to deal with this kind of thing. Now the next one is more of a scam that involves both an email and a website. And this one I think is very interesting because the website just looks so good that it's really scary. In fact, I was talking to a reporter from The Hill this weekend, and I told her, I bet you the website this points to is actually better designed than the real government website to hand out these stimulus payments. But the setup here pretends to be from the Fed, as you can see. You can see the link in the middle of the body was rewritten by ATP because this customer runs both Microsoft ATP and INKY, and they have Microsoft ATP rewrite the links. So you can see that although ATP didn't block it, at least they rewrote the link. That's why the link looks funny, but it really points to this help.economicimpactpayment.site domain. And one thing that's worth mentioning about that is, first of all, now you might not be fooled by economicimpactpayment.site as being a government site, but I think probably some people would. And it's important to point out, anybody can register any domain ever. They could just register whatever they want. And this was registered with Namecheap, which, as the name says, is really cheap. And this is just a fundamentally hard problem for the registrars. For the registrars to detect, hey, this is a malicious site, that's an AI problem. It's not clear, how many possible ways could you imagine the attacker can make up a new name that looks plausible for a site? We see ones, for example, targeting American Express, where American Express will use aexp.com as their real domain, and that's real. And then the attackers will do aexp-xy.com, which kind of looks like maybe it's also plausible. So this whole problem of attackers being able to establish new plausible looking identities through domain names is a huge one, and it's an unsolved one. But this thing points to the following site. Now look at this. So this looks really well designed. And in fact, probably this is the best looking phishing site I've ever seen. We see a lot of phishing sites that look like fake Office 365 login pages. And obviously those are pretty easy to create. The attacker just has to take the real page and save it. This one, it actually looks like, they paid a professional web design shop to make this site for them. And it's got a big call to action button to get your economic payment. Now even talks about, who's eligible for it. I think everybody here would agree this looks pretty darn real. And when you click through, you get a drop down that has all the banks. So again, a very slick user experience. And then when you click through, you get a perfectly branded login box purporting to be for your bank. So here's what happens if you click through Wells Fargo. Now, obviously, when you type in here, this is not going to Wells Fargo, it's going to the attacker. So the attacker is just running a credential harvesting operation to get everyone's banking credentials here. But I just think that the amount of effort that they've invested into this, they clearly thought ahead. They knew that people were going to be looking for these stimulus checks. They paid somebody to go, set up an entire website and do this beautiful design on it, all to do a credential harvesting operation. Just really goes to show you how sophisticated some of these guys are now. And then, the last one I have is, this is an impersonation of Trump. And again, this points to a site. It's not so much just an email. It's actually an email that links to a site. And this one is amusing for a couple of reasons. One is, really, is Donald Trump going to email you? Probably not. But I think some people might have fallen for this, but in the language in it, it's not exactly perfect, but it's pretty literate for a phishing email. So I think this, again, it seems reasonably plausible that this could be real. And if you notice here, it says tax day has been moved from April 15 to August 15. Well, it is true that tax day has been delayed, but the date August 15 is wrong. It's actually July 15 is the real date. So this is a lesson, don't rely on economic advice or tax planning advice from phishers. But if you click through this, you get this reasonably good looking page. And here's the reason this is reasonably good looking. This is the actual coronavirus page on the White House site as of when this email arrived. So the attacker took an exact replica, essentially, archived the real site and saved it on their own, ran it on their own web server. And they changed one thing, which is this call to action button here. On the real coronavirus site, it would give you a doc file that had information. Again, guidelines for coronavirus. What the attackers did was they took that same document and they loaded it with malware. So essentially, the user experience here is identical to what you would get going to the real coronavirus site on the White House page, except you get malware going along with it. So again, and this was registered with a cheap service, so it's easy, costs very little for the attacker to set up. And a lot of times these will be around for 2 hours or 4 hours and they'll be taken down. There again, though, the attacker's goal is not so much to snare everyone, just to snare some people. And then one I thought was interesting that I added in here as sort of a bonus. is this one. And, this isn't necessarily a great looking impersonation, obviously, but notice it uses the logo, and notice it uses this domain whoint.us. Now that's very interesting because the real WHO, their domain is who.int. So .int is the TLD for international organizations like the UN. So the WHO has one of those, and the attackers then, again, gone onto Namecheap, which is cheap, and they've registered this new domain. They've kind of been clever to make it plausible. And again, if you're Namecheap, how are you supposed to know this is deceptive? I mean, maybe you could, but there's just so many ways attackers can set this up. And then you hover over the link. We always tell people hover over the link to see if it's bad. They hover over it and it says whoint, so it looks kind of realistic, right? So obviously this again is a sending somebody to a credential harvesting. We've also seen variants of this where essentially it says, hey, this is your company. It's the head of HR. Someone in your company got COVID-19 and died, and get the information through this link. And it's again, they send you to a fake SharePoint page or something, and it's Office 365 credential harvesting. I mean, it just goes to show the degree to which these attackers will just be completely shameless in trying to exploit things that are topical that people are worried about. Right now it's COVID-19. Every year at holiday time, it'll be, hey, get a fake, get an Amazon gift card and it's fake, or here's a Target, free access to Target discounts. And they do it over the holidays because they know everybody's busy and buying presents. This is kind of the same thing. They're exploiting the fear that people have of COVID-19, the fact that they're all working from home, the fact that they may have their kids running around in the background and their dog barking and they're distracted, to exploit people and run the usual scams, whether that's credential harvesting or fake, wire for fraud, or whether it's, hey, go buy gift cards, all the same kind of mechanisms we see. They're just repurposed around these topics. And I thought this would be an interesting one because I know that Karim has some interesting information on the WHO as well. So I guess I'll turn it over to Karim, to you now, to talk about Prevailion.
Perfect. Thank you, Dave. I appreciate that. Let me go ahead and get my slides here. Thank you for having me attend. For some reason, it is not letting me advance to my slides for some reason. So bear with me.
Weird, yeah.
Yeah,
let me try
I'm not it.
There we go. I can do it for you.
I appreciate that, Dave. If you don't mind, I'm still seeing your impersonation with malware slides, so I'm a little, I'm flying blind here. So let me go ahead and do this. I apologize, guys. Let's see if we can get this to work. So while we're doing that,
and tell the audience if they have any questions, to feel free to type in the question mark, and we'll do some Q&A live video at the end of Karim's section.
That's perfect. So as long as everyone can kind of see my slides, that's what counts. I'll work over here in parallel.
They can see your first slide right now. So I'll advance it for you. We'll just try to stay in sync.
I appreciate that, Dave. Yep, a little technical difficulties, but I appreciate us working through it. So again, thank you for having me. My name is Karim Hijazi. If we can go to the background slide here, Dave, I appreciate that.
Yep.
I've got, interestingly, about 20 years plus of cybersecurity and intelligence experience. Originally starting with building the first corporate counterintelligence firm. And that's a pretty interesting little tidbit because back in the late 90s and early 2000s, counterintelligence was a very obscure term, most often associated with governments, still is, obviously, but corporate environments at the time needed as much as governments did. It just was not as well known. So really what we were doing in that era was effectively pursuing all what is fairly standard today, which is, vulnerability assessments, pen testing, looking for vectors of attack, if you will. And that was the focus during that time frame. Fast forwarding to 2010 or so, I memorialized and productized something that we had been working on as an internal tool at Demiurge, which eventually became a company called Unveilance. And Unveilance was looking to disrupt the command and control infrastructure of the adversaries. And by disruption, what I mean there is getting inside of it, understanding who the victims are associated with some of these groups. In the 2010, 2011 era, It was a lot easier to do. Adversaries weren't quite as sophisticated or as cunning as they are now. They've certainly managed to up their game substantially. Unfortunately, you hear this term a lot. The asymmetric quality of this is pretty pervasive. You've got a lot of access and availability, and that was a big problem that we noted. And vulnerability and assessing vulnerability is important, but it's a different level of seriousness to understanding levels of compromise. So Envalence was a success. I had a really wonderful experience for the 2 years that we owned it. We exited and sold the company to Mandiant in 2012, where I stayed aboard and assisted with the intelligence effort at Mandiant. Most notably, the APT1 report was something that was really, really pretty amazing output during that time frame. I left right before FireEye acquired Mandiant. It took a bit of time to pontificate some newer challenges. And in 2017, the concept of Prevailion was to use the similar methodology that we had employed during the Unvalence Mandiant timeframe, but now apply it with new technology 10 years later, but look at the supply chain third-party ecosystem problem. And what I mean by problem there is that is part of an attack surface that many organizations just don't have visibility into. It's easy to surmise what you may have as far as your perimeter an organization's concerned. And even then, that's challenging. We all know that. But it's even harder when you're dealing with organizations that are completely outside of your purview. You effectively have to take their word for it as far as what they're doing. So Prevailion's mission and vision was to sort of drive awareness and visibility into those third-party ecosystems, which was a key value that I saw not really out there at all in any way. So moving to the next slide. What I wanted to address here specifically was attack surface. And attack surface is an interesting term. It's really what an organization or a group of organizations determine to be where the vectors of attack may come from, or what accessibility an adversary may have to an organization. And I picked 3 specific slides here that I thought were really illustrative of the industry's perception and the reality. And the first slide that you can see here is this delusion slide, as I call it. And that is really, unfortunately, not everyone, but a lot of people have this idea that they have this perfect fortress. They've done a really good job of limiting access to their environment. There's maybe 1 or 2 access points to their organization, and they're closely monitored, and everything should be fine. And as long as we have a really good castle moat strategy, we should be in good shape. And that's been the de facto standard for 10 years now. Which is just armor up, and fend off the savages at the gates, and you should be okay. The problem is, next slide, you've got the reality slide. And that is unfortunately more the reality of what a third-party ecosystem looks like. There's interconnectivity between all these different organizations. There's VPN connections. There's people coming into offices with contaminated machines. Without any kind of proctoring. They get onto the network. Sometimes they get on a guest network, sometimes they don't. It is an absolutely just clustered mess, and contagion, which is a terminology that we're hearing about, on a daily basis now due to COVID, is actually something that is realistic and very viable in the cyber world as well, in the cyber realm as well. So it's a real problem. And then advancing next slide, Dave, if you please, we've got an even bigger problem, which is that not only do we have an incredibly vast open environment of compromise and accessibility to these organizations by way of their third-party partners, now you've got a remote workforce which resembles effectively herding cats. You've got everyone running around in different directions with all kinds of different tools, a lot of their own devices that they're believing to be in decent shape because that's what they understand it to be. And even in the best case scenarios where you have organizations that have armed their organizations with, or armed their team with the right kind of devices and the right kind of technologies, that still affords a really interesting ability for an adversary to leverage to get in. And in fact, we're watching an uptick in compromise because of the fact that home users are susceptible to all the other devices that might be on their networks at home that they don't have any control of. So it's become quite a challenge. And I thought this visual was very, very appropriate. Wranglers there being the security teams of these organizations, and then the teams now at home being the cats. It's something that we face personally, as well as a lot of other organizations that we know about. So the next slide gets into a little bit more of our tradecraft. What we do at Prevailion is unique. We actually look for the command and control of the malware that we're pursuing. And instead of delivering that information back to an organization to take a proactive measure with that intel, which is helpful, we actually go the other direction and we pursue the actual adversary infrastructure. And through the assistance of law enforcement and registrar and hosting relationships, we're able to get inside and basically lay dormant, passively collecting who's been victimized. So when the malware that's resident within some of these organizations beacons back out to its owner or its command and control, we're able to collect that evidence. And that's a pretty substantial amount, as you can probably imagine. We get billions of requests every day coming to our infrastructure that is actually the same information that is going to the adversary. So our perspective is that of the adversaries. In fact, we don't even know a company effectively exists until the malware within it calls out to its home base, which is where we reside. And then that evidence of compromise is then organized, enriched, and attributed, and instantly available via a subscription service to our customers. So we're purely, and when I say zero hardware, zero software, I mean it. There is literally nothing to be deployed. We don't require any configuration changes. We effectively sell logins to our environment and to our API for customers to use. And that gives them a pretty unprecedented visibility into what's going on. So the story so far in the next slide gets into a little bit of a screenshot of what we're able to provide to our customers so they can make some informed decisions. To date, we've collected about 18.8 billion, and this was a couple days ago when I actually took this screenshot for the deck. 18.8 billion beacons over the last 180 days. And that equates to somewhere over 19,000 different infected organizations at any given point. So it's a very substantial rate and velocity and cadence of compromise that we're seeing, which is pretty alarming. And I think what's most troubling about this is that in the last 180 days, we're talking about a pre-COVID scenario, right? So we're sitting here with bated breath to sort of see what's going to transpire over the next 180 days. What's the after effects of all this infiltration and seeding of the environment that we might be in for? What is to come? And what we've witnessed most notably is that most organizations have shown an increase of compromise by commodity malware. And what we mean by that is commodity malware is something that you can effectively buy off the dark web. It's something that is not exactly custom built. It's not typically something nation state derived. Now, I will say and put a caveat in there that nation states will indeed use commodity malware when it behooves their efforts. No need to go build the bridge when there's one there for you to use. Or if a door's already been opened by something fairly common, no reason to not use it to walk through it and then deploy a more sophisticated capability. And we don't necessarily have a 100%, we don't have total clarity around this, but there is an immense amount of compromise that is coming by way of these homebound teleworkers. So back to the whole theme of this, the attack surface has been expanded substantially because you're now dealing with people's home environments that represent what I like to say is almost a hypodermic needle into the corporate environments, because these home environments are almost like the syringe with a contaminated, sort of payload. And the needle literally is the trusted vector of communication into the organization. It's another vector similar to BEC, similar to what Dave was talking about earlier, which is obviously tremendously prolific. But this is one where if the adversary can get into a trusted machine, they literally can just walk through that trusted channel that's already been set up with the intention for it to be a secure way for the home worker to get to the corporate environment. So pretty troubling scenario here where the security technology that was intended to protect the organization could indeed be used as a conduit for the adversary to get in more easily than before. So the next slide addresses the state of compromise that we're seeing. And this is a very quick grab from what we're about to release, which is our Apex quarterly report. We put out a report that sort of is equivalent to what more or less would be like a Verizon breach report, talks about what we're seeing for compromise in a collective sense here. And what's really interesting here is, again, over 19,000 compromised companies in Q1 of 2020 that we've observed, which equates down into these other numbers, about 164,000 or so compromised IPs in 207 countries in 201 industry groups, in 89 subsectors, and 20 industry sectors. And we're able to derive this abstracted view of compromise because we first collect the ground truth data, which is essentially, this is the IP address that beaconed out to the command and control infrastructure of some adversary group or some malware type. That IP belongs to this organization belongs to this subsector and industry group and so on. And so we're able to compile some pretty interesting data around exactly which sectors and industries seem to be most impacted. And as one would expect in Q1, hospitals, pharmaceutical industry, aerospace, and the military industrial complex, oil and gas and supply chain have been the most targeted. Not a really huge surprise, I think, in light of what's been happening. The next slide does discuss a little bit of an emerging trend, which is concerning. Industry and sector compromise does seem to fluctuate based on geopolitical events. And so this chart that you're able to see with all these different colored lines, each line represents a different industry sector. And what we're addressing here is that if you look at the time frame there, and it's a little bit small to see, but that's somewhere right after early part of December 2019, wholesale trade spiked tremendously in terms of compromise. And there's probably a number of reasons why, but it doesn't fall flat that was right around the time that things started to get a little bit sketchy with the trade talks. People were getting a little bit upset about things. There was friction that was manifesting with the political climate at the time. So it's pretty interesting to see some of those corollaries. Now, it's hard to derive pattern from one spike for that matter, but it's absolutely relevant when you start saying, hold on a minute. If you look at the fact that now there's a huge decline right around early January, which is when the COVID-19 thing started to manifest pretty substantially in China. And then you see an uptick slowly around, early April when things started to recover. It's pretty telling. And then you'd see a couple other sectors here, the election talks or election activity started to kind of drum up around that time frame in February with public administration showing an uptick in compromise. And then accommodation and food services, a very interesting space to be attacked, but not surprising because we did notice the Marriott hack. This is indeed an effort for harvesting PII by the adversary so they can match it with other data they're collecting, build full profiles, and sell these out there from a profiteering standpoint.
Somehow we lost the slide here. Sorry about that. Let me see if I can restart it.
No problem. So we're on slide 9. So no problem, Dave. Let me know when you get back to that.
I think this platform slide sharing is beta, but so we may be guinea pig. Okay, now we're on when the cat's away.
Got it. So if we could go to slide number 9 of mine, which is a startling trend emerging.
Back to that. Okay, got it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So really what I was going to kind of finish this slide off with was the reduction of security teams on premises coupled with a disparate workforce has really been the problem. I think it's that confluence of events that really has created a real challenging situation here. Hopefully the next slide does go there, which is when the cats are away.
Yep.
Dave, if you're able to do that one. Sorry, flying blind here, so let's make sure everyone's able to see what I'm seeing. So this is a large automotive manufacturer in northern Italy, and this is a tragic story here. This is really something that is pretty compelling too. This illustrates visibly what's been transpiring. The very beginning of those orange bars on that spark line is when the majority of the staff were asked to go home. Let's not take the risk or the chance here. Let's go to a skeleton crew. And you can see that literally as people departed and they went to a much more reduced team, malware started to manifest much more rapidly. It probably laterally moved throughout the network. And then when you see the beginning of the red lines, that's the exact date that everyone went remote completely. So pretty compelling view. Certainly something that does not look like it's on a downturn quite yet. I think that it's going to be a little while until they can get a handle on this. Certainly not a blame game here. This is a very unfortunate scenario that just illustrates many companies we're seeing within the platform that simply just cannot get their bearings during this time frame, and it's resulting in these after effects that, we hate to say it, but in Prevailion, our perspective is that we haven't even really seen what the effects are from this from a cyber perspective. We're seeing some of the stuff that Dave's catching, which is thankfully he's there to help with some of this, but we're going to see a lot more seeding of some of this malware over this next time frame, which is pretty concerning. The next slide is what we consider a malicious persistence, and this is what Dave was referring to with regard to the World Health Organization here. And another spark line here of interest, because it does show a completely different type of cadence. You can see green, which in our world means a stabilized environment. We would never suggest that they're clean, but we just say that, you know, we haven't seen anything beacon from them in recent times. And then you see a giant orange spike, which is effectively a stronger, beefed up cadence and velocity of communication back to command and control. It could be any number of things. It could be exfil of data. It could be requesting a new version of itself so it can evade signature detection tools, any number of things. And then you see a decline, and then we have a decay period with the yellow, and then we get back to sort of a nice stabilized green, and then we have another pop. And so the reality here is that it could be a number of things. Two scenarios are that one is that the malware remains persistent, and it's just evading remediation attempts. So it's sort of hopping around. This particular threat type is able to store itself on the master boot record of the machine, which means that it can survive things like wipes, and it can reinstall itself when an image is put back on of the OS. So it's pretty resilient stuff. The other scenario is that it's going to ground. So there is no remediation effort going on. That's another scenario here, which is even more alarming. And what it's doing is it's sort of saying, all right, I'll stand by. And when you need me, you let me know, and I'll go get what you might, or I'll help facilitate something for you. I'll deploy more technology or malware for that matter from the adversary into this environment to do your bidding. And that's another possibility here. The next slide really drills down into sort of what we expect to see the future. And I termed it easy targets to consumer IP space. This is the attack surface. These are all the different providers, and these are just 3 of them, of course, but there's many of them all around the world that represent basically the IPs that now are being handed out to the home users. These are obviously fair game. Unfortunately, it's beyond simply a machine like a phone or a laptop being compromised. It's something like routers. It's embedded technology that could be compromised very easily. There's a lot there that we're going to see coming in the next little while. This again is something that we've just seen over the last 180 days. We expect a substantial uptick here in terms of compromise. Now, this is an interesting picture because what it suggests is that this is a mixture of IPs dedicated to corporations as well as to home users as well. So it's been a pretty interesting scenario here to watch.
It sounds like people sounds like people who went back to the cover slide again. Maybe try sharing your screen.
Okay. Yeah.
Because to me, it looks like it's on the slide you want, but then one of the attendees is saying it's on the cover slide. So
got it. Okay.
Maybe I'll end slides and try to do share screen.
Yep. Let me go ahead and give that a shot here. And hey, we're hopefully helping. All right. Can everyone see my screen? Hopefully. Let's see here. I'm gonna have to ask, and hopefully someone will be able to.
Yeah.
Reply. All right. Good. Dave, are you able to see easy targets slide here?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. All right. So hopefully fewer bumps going toward the end of this thing. Basically, the most interesting thing here, and I wanted to put this in here to kind of really put a stake in the ground to emulate what Dave was getting at. Business email compromise. While at Prevailion, we don't focus on the vector of infection. We sort of look at the post-mortem of it. So someone like Dave and INKY would be a really tremendous partner to someone like Prevailion. Dave would see something that's out there that you should be worried about. We would see the after effects of someone clicking on the link that they shouldn't have, because now that they're beaconing out to an environment. But we do a certain amount of understanding of what happens once someone clicks that link, and this is exactly what this is. This was something that I found particularly nefarious because this was a weaponized CV.
Sorry to interrupt again. Apparently they can see us, but not the screen. Click on the lower right, share screen. See if that does. I can see part of your screen, but
yeah, it says sharing. So I'm not sure if it just doesn't seem to want to cooperate. Bright Talk may have failed this one for us. Let's see here. I'll try sharing screen again, see if this cooperates. Sorry, guys.
Karim, why don't you talk to it? Because we're going to almost get to questions for a minute here.
We are. Yeah. Unfortunately, no problem. These are the ones that would have been good to see. They show bug strings with some Russian literature in them, which is pretty interesting. So really, I will cap this off with just an audio play. Really, it is a very big problem to see some of this happen. And I think that we're going to see an uptick in BEC, or business email compromise, focused on what is apropos to the times, right? So for example, we saw a ton of the COVID stuff like Dave brought up. We saw a ton of the stuff regarding alerts coming from the World Health Organization. We saw some Trump stuff. Then we saw this, as I was mentioning, which unfortunately can't show you here, but it was basically the weaponization of CVs or resumes. With everyone being laid off or furloughed, resumes were flying around everywhere. And it's the one document that you kind of can't afford to click on, because that's how you got to see whether someone's actually a good candidate or not. So it's really, really sly and really, really tricky. We anticipate we're going to see things like mortgage scams in the next little while. I think, Dave will speak to this very well, obviously, which is what he'll be watching for. But we'll be watching for what transpires once people are impacted by it substantially. Again, to kind of wrap up this piece here, it is an interesting perspective that we have. We're able to get a really interesting and compelling view of high fidelity intelligence on who's impacted, unlike conventional IOC platforms that are, kind of doing net flow and grabbing a bunch of information from a location and then surmising whether it's malicious or not. What we're able to do is definitively understand signal, because we're looking at malware communicate with an endpoint. So it does give us a unique perspective, and the use cases are being used tremendously in a lot of different areas. Most notably now with what's going on, it's absolutely to sort of understand how their posture is as per our whole presentation, and how their partners' postures are, so they can actually preemptively limit their exposure to those. Or it's to look at new organizations that they may want to partner with or possibly even acquire, so that we don't have something like the Marriott situation happen again, where they, acquired Starwood. Unbeknownst to them, Starwood had a latent infection that then perpetuated and laterally moved into the Marriott network, and for all intents and purposes appears to still be there. X number of months later, they're suffering from a sustained attack still. So sort of pretty tremendous issue. But again, I want to thank you all for watching this. As troublesome as it was to get the slides out there, hopefully it was informative and interesting.
Yeah, thank you, Karim, and thank you, Dave. So I got a couple questions for you guys. This would be pretty useful for the attendees. So, so Dave, how quickly can you install INKY, and how quickly can you get value out of it? Like, does it need to be trained once it's reading email?
Yeah, good question. I mean, it's essentially a one-click install for most organizations. I mean, sometimes a larger organization will want to look at, we basically run some PowerShell in the background that installs transport rules and connectors. Sometimes larger organizations will want to look at that and run it manually, but most, mid-market companies, it's like off to a web page and it's a one-click install. And then one of the advantages of our platform is that we typically deploy downstream either from, Microsoft EOP, or if the customer has an incumbent SAG like a Proofpoint or a Mimecast or a Cisco, downstream from that. So we can do a proof of concept over a couple of weeks where we show exactly what we catch above and beyond what's already being caught by the upstream system. So, it generally takes only a couple days before we find something that's pretty juicy. So it's pretty compelling. And in terms of learning, there are some aspects of the system that we generally let learn for a couple of weeks. The sender profiling stuff I mentioned, where it tries to understand, is this a normal mail for this sender? That does take about 2 weeks to learn. But the rest of the system, I mean, the vast majority of it, all the brand forgery detection, that stuff works right out of the box. So I would say the majority of it works from day one, and then there's some stuff it does have to learn in a couple weeks.
And Karim, same question. How do I deploy your product? You said I don't have to put an agent. I'm not sharing much with you. So how do I deploy it?
No deployment at all. So great question, Ron. We literally provide logins to our platform. Those logins afford access to the UI that is available through a Chrome browser, as well as the API that could be machine readable data. And that information can be organized in terms of your own environment, so your own IP space. And when I say IP space, I am referring to their public-facing IP space. If they want to look at any other organization, they can literally go to what it looks like a literally a search engine where you can type in a company name and it will provide you the results of how that organization looks from a compromise standpoint. So no kidding, no hardware, no software, no configuration changes, simply a login.
And then I'll start with you for the next question. So then who is your typical buyer, right? Like I'm imagining it's not necessarily the SOC operator who's running, CrowdStrike or Cisco or something like that. So who are you selling to mostly?
Yeah, it's a good question. We have a couple buyer personas that we focus on. One that is most interesting, and it's not as common as we'd like it to be, is someone like a chief risk officer. Not every organization has one. They are typically responsible for kind of all manner of risk to the organization. It could be the physical risk, it could be the financial risk, but it also dovetails into the cyber risk. And cyber risk then has the overarching responsibilities of understanding what their supply chain looks like, their vendor environments and everything else. And they're typically someone that we would talk to. However, we have successfully sold into the SOC to actually, help organizations understand how they can mitigate some of their own challenges with our intelligence. We've also sold to M&A groups that are interested in looking at organizations for either acquisition or investment. So that dovetails into things like chief legal officers and even CEOs for that matter. And then lastly, what's interesting is we've actually enabled and empowered some of the security teams of these organizations to even solicit further budget for their security apparatus, because we, by definition, act as a test of their security infrastructure that's been deployed, that's in production. Because frankly, if Prevailion sees it, it means that the security layers that have been put in place or their investment has actually not worked, or is probably not as finely tuned as they'd like it to be. More akin to the slides, hopefully someone saw some of those in the earlier part of the deck, where they're still porous and they're still permeable. So there is indeed a CISO buyer that does see the value in this from that perspective. So yep, it's sort of across the board, but it definitely dovetails from risk up all the way through to the CEO level.
Excellent. We're going to come back to the sort of the audit aspect of that. And actually, Dave, I want to ask you about that. So with the banners in the email, right with the users, does the way INKY works, does that check any boxes for phishing awareness training or any type of compliance regulations?
Yeah, really good question. So one of the things that's kind of interesting is that, I mentioned that the banners are sort of micro training, and actually we like to say we help you get more value out of your initial existing investment in phishing awareness training if you've made one. So, when INKY sees a mail that's a know before simulated phishing attack or a co-fence one, it actually knows that those are simulations. And so it can react differently when the user reports it, right? So we can feed the report into the phishing awareness training group instead of sending it to the SOC. If it's a real one, obviously we send it to the SOC. And all that banner text is all, the customers can tailor what that says and brand it. So, I think it is a way to get more efficacy out of an existing investment in phishing awareness training, even though we don't really position it as phishing awareness training per se. I always like to say, it's good to have phishing awareness training. We would say that's necessary, but not sufficient. You also want to have, phishing awareness training is about training the humans to identify fish. You also want to have the silicon life forms identifying the fish too. So you want to have the humans and the machines both doing this. And they both sort of like feed off each other and help each other.
And Dave, have you seen any change in the phishing rates or attacks with people working at home? I mean, they're still checking.
It's hugely high. It's hugely spiked. I mean, in March, it's gone way up. Just across the board, phishing's up, and then this coronavirus, we've probably seen more than 24 specific phishing templates that just target coronavirus.
Very cool. And Karim, could you talk at all about, when you talk about supply chain, it was just getting some momentum before the COVID, crisis kind of hit, but the DoD's CMMC, where we have to audit the supply chain of providers. With your visibility into that, I mean, what do you think of that program, and what can Prevailion do to help audit our supply chain in the U.S.?
Sure. No, I'm hugely endorsing of that program. We're going to be playing a very strong role in some of that, very similar to the way the MITRE ATT&CK framework had sort of devised a really good standardized framework around malware and categorization. I think that our intelligence, because of the high signal quality of it, it can be used almost in an actuarial fashion, right? To use kind of an insurance term. Because it's one thing to surmise, again, we talked about this earlier, the vulnerability of an organization, the potential for exploitability, but it's an entirely different thing to look at active compromise. And even more importantly, it's really key to understand the systemic success or failure of that organization over time, because that's going to really dictate how that organization is going to go forward. I have a sort of lighthearted way to sort of address it. It's kind of like TripAdvisor or Yelp. It takes a while for some of the bad ratings to kind of go away. And a lot of times it's sort of a retooling of the entire kitchen and waitstaff and maitre d' sometimes, because that's fundamentally the problem. And I'm not trying to rag on anyone's security teams, but it really has a lot to do with the systemic failures of that team. And sometimes this is more of a change management issue. I'm sure Dave's probably nodding there. You have to get people to fundamentally change their method of doing things sometimes. And it's not just about putting another box in or new technology. It's going to be shifting the mentality of how this works. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on where you sit, Prevailion is that really, really kind of bold, hey, look, we're simply sitting back collecting. We didn't come looking for you. You looked for us. You're going to have to face the music, the fact that we see malware coming from your environment. So we think it'll be very powerful for that initiative.
Excellent. All right. Well, last question for both of you. Thank you very much for sharing so much about your companies. And on that note, what does the name of your company mean? So Karim, go first. Prevailion, where did it come from? What does it mean?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's one of my favorite ones. So Prevailion's a really interesting domain that I purchased, literally, I kid you not, probably around 2001. And I got it because I had the best intentions to build something down the road that would provide the ability for organizations to prevail through hard times. And I know it sounds like I'm making this up. And I like the idea of something that mixed this idea of a pavilion where you could go and there would be a coalescence of different groups of thoughts and process to be able to merge ideas and then deliver a way to sort of prevail through those times. And unbelievably, this company's manifested in the way that it has. And all of the words that describe what we do all start with that pre. There's a precognitive aspect to what we do. There's a preemptive and a predictive capability. And so Prevailion couldn't be a better fit for what we do. And I wish I could tell you it was all by design, but it wasn't. But it did work out very well.
Awesome. Awesome. David, same question. What does INKY mean?
Yeah, I get that a lot. So I like the idea, even going back like 5 years, I like the idea of trying to capture communication, writing. Ink sort of captures this concept of, we've been around, we've been communicating in written form forever. And this is just the email's just sort of the modern version of that. But then we also found out, apparently, we didn't know this, but the octopus actually has an ink defense weapon. Like we all sort of knew squid had that, the squid ink, but octopuses have that too. And it turns out octopuses are really, really smart. They actually have more than one brain. So we like the idea of this incredibly smart creature. And I think it's really important now in cybersecurity, now that cybersecurity has matured, to have really distinctive branding that's memorable. And the one thing I will say that makes me very proud is people don't necessarily remember what INKY does, but they will remember, oh, INKY, you're the octopus one. You're that one with the octopus. Like, yes, that's the first step of getting anybody to remember what your company does, is get them to remember your company at all. So it's sort of gratifying. We kind of went all in on making the characters sort of distinctive and cute for that reason.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you, both you guys, for sharing so much, taking some time out of your day. Thanks, everybody, for watching this video. And if you're watching this in the future, I hope you continue to be safe and healthy. We did have one question on the slides. We'll see what we can do about getting the slides put on the Bright Talk there. But both Karim and Dave are on Twitter. You can definitely hit us up. Thanks again for everybody's attention. Be safe and healthy.